edition of the 16th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. I hope you're all cleaning your hands very well. We are delighted to introduce Grasping Greatness, Making India a Leading Power. Grasping Greatness, Making India a Leading Power, edited by Ashley J. Tellis, is a book by Bibek Debroy and C. Raja Mohan, which examines the past, present, and future of India and its policy choices. An eminent array of thinkers reflect on the path ahead as India seeks to break through developmental challenges and transform into its true potential as a key player in global politics. Our first speaker today, Mr. C. Raja Mohan, is a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute in Delhi and a visiting research professor at the National University of Singapore. His recent books include Asia's New Geopolitics, Military Power, and Regional Order. Our second speaker today is Mr. Bibek Debroy, who's one of India's leading economists and the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. He's one of the foremost authorities on Indology as well. His magnum opus is his Mahabharata project, and he has also translated the Valmiki Ramayana, the Bhagavad Gita, and Puranas, including the Brahma Purana, Markandeya Purana, and the Vishnu Purana. Our moderator today is Ms. Lakshmi Puri, who's a former IFS officer and ambassador of the country. She's a distinguished fellow of the Indian Association of International Studies and recipient of the prestigious Eleanor Roosevelt Award Prize for Human Rights. She's also a published author of several reports and research papers. Ladies and gentlemen, Grasping Greatness, Making India a Leading Power, C. Raja Mohan and Bibek Debroy in conversation with Lakshmi Puri. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this session, which is, which is very evocative of the way the Jaipur Literature Festival began, with an invocation to Goddess Saraswati, Varade, or Desh ka Udhar kar, Bharat ka Udhar kar. So in that spirit, I would like to say that as a diplomat for several decades, an Indian diplomat representing India abroad, I have never once doubted why India should be great or its potential. But I have always agonized about how, what, and when. So I'm really grateful to our distinguished panelists, Raja Mohan ji and Bibek ji, and of course Ashley Tellis, for having put together, of course authored, but also put together some of the best minds, experts, and thinkers to really delve into this issue of how India can progress to becoming from what it is, as the book says, a balancing power, a bridging power, a major power, an emerging power, a rising power. From that to be a leading power, a great power. So that's what this book, and I would really recommend all of you to read, because it is indeed a very comprehensive examination and a pathway, a roadmap to how India can get there, what are the shortcomings, but also how we can get there. The other aspect that this book is so timely, because this is the India at 75 moment. This is when Prime Minister Modi, as the first Prime Minister, and the authors have said so, with his bold imagination, he has conceptualized this, idea of India as a great power. And both in soft power and hard power terms. And this is also the time when he has set certain goals in terms of military power and work towards it, Shashakt Bharat, also 2047 to be a developed country. So all these, along with the fact that people are saying that this is India's century, going to be India's century. And I just read Mahbubani's article, which said that India has never been in a better geopolitical soft spot, sweet spot. So that is where we are. And also, we have been compared, you know, this is also the time when China seems to have risen, and we, the other Asian major power, are seen to be rising. So, and there are comparisons being made. What pathways will we use to rise, and how will we behave as a risen power? So all of these make for a fascinating analysis and exploration, and I would like to ask the co-editors and authors to reflect on that. So let me begin with you, Bibek ji, on the economic heft and what is needed to make India an economic power, because that is that muscle and heft is what is needed to be also a great power.
Thank you, Lakshmi ji, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first start by correcting what was said in the introduction, not by Lakshmi ji, the earlier introduction, which said this was a book by Ashley Tellis, edited by Raja Mohan and Bibek Debroy, which sounds very odd. It is actually a book that is edited by Ashley Tellis, Raja who's here, and me. We have our own individual essays, but it's a collection of essays. It has actually 13 essays by 16 different authors, because some of them have co-authored pieces. As Lakshmi ji said, this book is called Grasping Greatness. I think one should look at it as a sequel, because there was an earlier book which was published in 2014, also edited by us, and that book that was published in 2014 was called Getting India Back on Track. And the model was very similar. We asked knowledgeable people to write essays. So if you read the current book and find that some prominent people have not been requested to write papers, that's because they wrote papers in the earlier volume. And let me again stress what the earlier volume was called. It was Getting India Back on Track. The fact that this time it's called Grasping Greatness suggests deliberately that India is already on track. And now, therefore, it is a question of grasping greatness. This particular sequel was planned a little bit earlier. It got postponed. The essays had to be revised because of COVID, so it's only been published recently. So the first question that arises is, how do you define greatness? And this takes off from an essay that Ashley wrote in 2016, defining a leading power. And the definition of a leading power perforce will have quite a bit on the economics part of it, and the economics part of it will necessarily be driven by reforms that have already been implemented, or reforms that are being implemented, or reforms that will be implemented. And in this set of essays, you have quite a few essays on the economic part of it, on what needs to be done to make labor more productive, land more productive, capital more productive, to increase India's productivity, and also the institutions that are required to change to ensure that India moves to this higher growth trajectory. In addition, there are essays which deal with defense, external security, and of course, international relations.
Thank you, Vivek. And now to you, Rajaji. How do you look at foreign policy, which is a necessary complement also, but also a force multiplier for power, hard and soft power, and a deliverer of soft power? So how do you look at that scenario, and do you think that there have been transformational movements made by Prime Minister Modi, and that will lead us to our greatness path?
Thank you, Ambassador Lakshmi Puri. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. And I think this book, as was said, coming on the 75th anniversary of our independence, we hope will be an important contribution to thinking about where India is headed in the world. For greatness needs at least two different things. One is material power, that is, without economic growth, without economic strength, there can be no foreign policy, there can be no external relations. So the sine qua non or precondition for greatness is a strong economy. And along with economic resources, a strong military is equally important. So these are what we call the hard power. But there is a third element which was missing, I believe, for a long time in the Indian thinking, is the political will, that the capacity to use your material resources to advance your position in the international system. Let me here say that if you go back to the 1950s, we kept talking about India as a developing country, India as a poor country. It's quite interesting how this idea actually set us back. Today there is a lot of celebration that India has become the 5th largest economy, but we were the 6th largest in 1950. So we've taken a long time to come back to the same place. Because I think part of the problem, which is not often said, and it's not a criticism of any particular leader or government, there was a relative decline of India in spite of being the 6th largest economy in 1950, and India was in the top 10 economies till 1970. Absolutely. And then we begin to drop off until the turn of the millennium. So in some senses, that we are crawling back to where we were in 1947, which is a good basis. And I think the second part of it was that if you keep telling yourself you are a weak developing country, your policies, your engagements are limited by yourself. I think what has changed in the last 2 decades is the idea that India can be a major power, India can be a great power. I give a lot of credit to our former President Kalam, who wrote a book in 2000, as it happened, saying India can be a developed country. As opposed to a developing country, third world, the third world idea was so deeply seeped in our mentality that even arguing that India can become great was seen as some kind of a crazy idea. But I think to his credit, Mr. Kalam really wrote that India can be a developed country. And since then, we've seen how India thinks about itself and how India relates to the rest of the world. Both have changed. And that change has been facilitated by one, expanding material resources on the economic front, and the willingness today to think about the world differently and think about our role differently. So if you go back, in terms of what we're doing today specifically, the idea that we would stay away from major power politics, the idea of non-alignment. But today we are saying we want to be engaging everyone for our own benefit, and that this is not something you stay away from. Because they used to be said about India in the 20th century, second half, that we were like a linesman at the football match, running along the line saying offside, 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 criticizing other powers what they were doing, but you are not in the field. But I think today, as the 5th largest economy, on its way to becoming the 3rd largest, I think today the change is that India is willing to get into the field, dribble the ball, use your elbows sometimes, you have to use football, that we are in a different place because it is the political will that we can leverage our resources to build a different set of relationship. And there I would conclude with another thought, which is our aggregate numbers make us a major power. But we should not forget the per capita figures still suggest we have a lot of work to do internally.
Absolutely.
So the trick for being a major power is how do we use our collective weight to promote the prosperity of our own people
Absolutely.
and to expand the welfare and prosperity for our own people. And then to do that, your collective strength today, for the first time, gives you the capacity to write the rules of the international system that can be beneficial for our growth, our prosperity, and our elevation. So I think the big shift is from being a rule taker and from being a conscious objector. Today, we are talking about India playing an important role in shaping the international system in order that the rules work for us better than they have before.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, I myself experienced how from being a system taker, we have been playing a part in system shaper, in being a system shaper, well beyond our league in the past. But I think, as you rightly mentioned, we are now in that space that we are beginning to be the system maker. And that is that sweet spot that we were referring to earlier. Bibek, you have very much focused on how institutions need to be reformed and how institutions that are reformed must take us to that place of greatness in maximizing power, in accumulating power. So how is that happening, and what is your recipe to get there, to make it fit for purpose, institutions fit for purpose?
Before I react to that, let me add 2 comments as sort of footnotes to what Raja has already said. The expression developed economy is an expression that we were familiar with as students. It is not an expression that is used generally any longer. The expression that is generally used by the World Bank is in terms of classifying countries on the basis of per capita income. Developed today would be equivalent to high income country.
Yeah.
Which would roughly be a per capita income of $13,000 a year. 75th year of independence, Amrit Kaal, the trajectory and template for the next 25 years leading up to 2047. No matter how optimistic your projections are in terms of real rate of growth, you would find that in 2047 we will just fall short of that. We will not cross the threshold of $13,000. We will fall a little bit short. We will be upper middle income, not necessarily high income. That automatically leads to a greater importance in India's clout, which Raja has mentioned, reflected in G20, reflected in Quad, reflected in a whole lot of other things. But one of the things that the so-called developed countries have to recognize is the emergence of these emerging powers, leading powers, and the reform of the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the International Monetary Fund, and GATT WTO. That reform is still pending. The word reform is often used, let's say in the domestic context. However you define the word reform, it involves competition, it involves a reliance on markets. Markets are not agricultural mandis. Markets are a theoretical construct that are used by economists These markets always function in a certain historical context, often set by the legal framework. And the legal framework today for every policy of ours is the constitution of the country. And the constitution of the country is defined by three organs of state as mentioned in the constitution: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. So if reforms embedded in that institutional structure are to take off, one needs to reform these three also: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Neither the earlier volume nor this volume talks about the legislature and the judiciary. We are saving it for the sequel after we have checked out what the Contempt of Courts Act has to say on this. Our essay is on the executive. It is on reforming of the executive, which normally does not always figure in the discourse on economic reforms. So we've talked about reform of the ministerial system. We have talked about reform of the bureaucracy, which really means, in the context of our essay, the all India services. There is an equally important area of reforming the civil services further down, because the cutting edge or the blunting edge of reforms is often at the lower level of civil services, including the state government. So if you're going to criticize this book, you cannot possibly criticize it on grounds of commission. You will criticize it on grounds of omission. So I guess the defense would be, there will be at least one sequel, perhaps many sequels in the plural.
Yes, absolutely. Rajaji, you want to add something to that? But I just want to make one comment, because this is power. Becoming a great power is about capabilities and recognition, and capabilities in a number of areas, military, and would you like to touch on the military aspect, because that's a very important aspect, both from the security point of view as well as recognition and projection point of view?
I would say first, to deal with the paradox that Bibek pointed out, that if you look at per capita incomes, we won't be developed in a definitional sense. I mean, what the World Bank uses today. But I lived last 4 years in Singapore, which has a per capita income of 72,000 US dollars. 72,000 US dollars. India is just around $2,000. But your size gives you certain advantages which a small country does not have, despite high per capita income. Singapore can't afford a space program, while in India can send a rocket to the moon or to the Mars, because your aggregate resources can be pooled to do the kind of things which Singapore, a lot of rich countries are not capable of doing on their own. So I think here you are, as we go ahead, India's aggregate numbers will get better and better. But as I said, our task internally to upgrade that must necessarily remain. So therefore, both are realities. But the size gives you advantages. Today, just China too is like us. As a large country, it's the second largest economy. But in terms of per capita income, is nowhere near Singapore. But then the size gives it the kind of clout that it can use the international system for its own benefit, shape the rules around it, and dominate the international system. And a crucial part of it is large countries can have large militaries. And I think the question of military power, often we downplay that. But I think for us in India, that a military power and the reforming of our military, there is a long chapter in the book on how do we reform our military, because we are caught in a situation. I think India was dealt a bad hand. The partition of the subcontinent produced new sovereignties within the subcontinent, of having to defend the long and disputed borders in the post-partition siblings of India. A second challenge for us has been China's occupation of Tibet in 1950. China was not our neighbor, and that's the reason why our border in the north is called the Indo-Tibetan border, but today it is a China-India border. Therefore, what India found itself in 1947 is that two aspects. One, India got divided and China got united. Second, China's expansion to the Himalayas put us on a two-front situation, and which has been the fundamental condition under which we have to defend ourselves. And I think Indian Army, Indian military have done a great job. But I think the challenge for us is, as China's military modernizes and keeps supporting Pakistan, I think our task of reorganizing, both in terms of how we organize our military. There's been a lot of debate of Chief of Defense Staff. We talk about theater commands. And it's not easy to reform large institutions like the military, but there's a big debate. And I think this chapter deals with it. Second, also, how do we defend a long border with China, for example, 3,700 kilometers? Are we going to defend it every inch? Or are you going to use more technology? Or are you going to put more divisions on the border? This is again an issue. This chapter deals with it. And then the role of technology today. How technology can be used to make ourselves more secure. And we're seeing in the Ukraine war, artificial intelligence are being used today in a manner that unbelievably transforming the nature of the battlefield. So I think we are in a situation where many fundamental assumptions about how we organize our defense have to change. And I think this is going to be very hard. And I think the debate has just begun. We're hoping that this year and next, some more reforms will begin to unfold. But I think our challenges have grown and the need for reform has grown.
Absolutely. And you've talked about the bleeding wound of Pakistan on the strategic polity, body polity of India's security. But let me come to another aspect which is a big India great power advantage. It's the world's oldest, largest, most complex and vibrant democracy and diverse. But it also poses, and that is in itself a big stake that the world has in our success and in our becoming a leading power. As opposed to some of the other systemic successes that we have seen, and President Biden very rightly said when he was commenting on our vaccine success story, that India has shown that democracies deliver, that democracies work. But in terms of the book's analysis too, there is a very clear constraint that we sometimes face when what has been called wielding special interests block reforms in different fields. You talked about military reforms, you've talked about economic reforms. So, Bibek, how do you think we can really maximize the democracy advantage without being held hostage to such interests that block reform?
Again, before responding to the question, let me add a couple of things to what Raja has already said. Angus Madison and his work, and those who followed his work, something like the first century India, of course India then is not quite what India is now geographically. India then was economically very important. But if you look at per capita incomes then, the difference as estimated in per capita incomes between India then and Europe then, that differential was very low, but that is not what made for the big difference. The main difference was the aggregate size of the economy. Some years ago, there was the famous Goldman Sachs Dreaming with the BRICS report. What we sometimes forget is that the Goldman Sachs Dreaming with the BRICS report had a real rate of growth on an average of 5.5% for India. The explosion that happened was because of the exponential power of growth. Ashley's essay in this volume has some projections, not his own, he was citing others, on what is likely to be the real rate of growth for India in the next couple of decades. And that's about 6.5%. The point being that if my timeline is 2047, the per capita income may be just about 10,000 US dollars, but the size of the economy will be pretty close to 20 trillion. Which means that if I'm not doing purchasing power parity, if I'm doing purchasing power parity, it improves even more. But which it means is, according to official exchange rates, in 2047, India will be the third largest economy in the world after China and the United States. You extend it by a few years and you come to around 2050, India will be the second largest economy in the world after China. Coming back to democracy, no essay in this volume directly addresses the issue of democracy. So let me give my personal opinion. Our essay also does not directly address the issue. Democracy and the correlation between democracy and development has been explored a lot empirically in the literature. And the literature establishes that democracy is neither necessary nor sufficient for development. So far as I am concerned, democracy is an end in itself. Whether it has an impact on economic development or not is beside the point. We were students during the emergency years. Raja has lived in Singapore, so have I. Would I like to live in Singapore? No, I would not. I love this vibrant democracy of discussion, debate, controversy. When one looks at the empirics, one looks at countries that are not democracies, which seem to have outperformed us in economic development. But those reflect a sampling bias. If you just pick some countries from East Asia and oil resource economies from the Middle East and say they outperform us, that's selective sampling. I can think of a whole range of countries from Africa and South America which have not been democracies and have been disastrous in terms of economic performance. So as far as I'm concerned, democracy is non-negotiable. And when we talk about democracy, we tend to think only of union government and state governments. Think of the enormous amount of social empowerment that has come about because of the third tier of government. There is a gentleman, I forget whether from Himachal or Uttarakhand, who has voted in every election since 1951, 1952. Go and tell him that democracy is irrelevant. He will shoo you away. The democracy is irrelevant and democracy imposes a tax is an argument that is advanced by a certain section of the urban elite who rarely go out to vote.
Very good. Thank you. I think we are, before I give the floor for some questions, I just want to also, I second your idea that we need a sequel to this book because I personally would like to see something more on this whole issue of soft power, India's civilizational state, and also the, not only leapfrogging, but pole vaulting that can happen in our power with technological, prowess being increased several times. So that's something that I would like any future volumes to also look at to compensate for some of the other deficits. How can some of these other elements break? But I was fascinated by a thought which I will come back to after the questions about another chapter which is on ideas, you know, the chapter of Rahul Sagar, but I'll come back to that. And let me take some questions. Let us take some questions. The young man there in the center.
Right, so you might say that I have a bone to pick here, but it's a democracy. It all comes from asking and wondering why certain things don't happen.
Your
and we
question, yeah, sure.
We talk about a great nation, right? We talk about 2047. Let's just consider the fact that I come from Delhi. I come from a place where we have to cover up the slums every time a foreign delegation comes through. The fact that I live in a country, India, the 5th largest economy, where you still have, you're still on the 107th spot on the hunger scale, right? So there's these smaller, there's internal issues here that we sometimes forget as intellectuals when we're considering the military, when we're considering the economy as a whole, India as a whole. We forget these things, and even while we were having this discourse, when we opened up, it just seemed a little off to me that we talk about the path to a great nation without considering the fact that there's a lot of people out there who sleep hungry, who don't have clothes. You know, that's the kind of place I come from. Thank you.
Can I respond to that? Or?
Yes, please.
That sounded like a comment, and you picked a bone without, of course, having read the book. Since this is a book discussion, it's always advisable to read the book. Now, so far as your bone is concerned, I will not react to the Global Hunger Index, which is specifically mentioned, but I will recommend that you take a look at the National Family Health Survey version 5, which documents the improvements in basic necessities that has been extended to the population. I will not refer you to government dashboards. I will refer you to external third-party audits, which recommend, which endorse the improvements that have happened. So far as being hungry is concerned, I would recommend that you take a look at what the NSS data says instead of relying on global indices. Yours was a comment. I will take it as an invitation that you are giving to us, to request you, provided you fit the other criteria, to write an essay in the sequel. We will look at it.
I would just...
Raja, you want to add to
I
this?
think we said right at the beginning that there are two realities. Both are realities. That if you are a $4 trillion economy, you are the third largest. That doesn't mean your per capita income is high. We said right in the beginning, India's per capita income is $2,000. That means there is a huge amount of underdevelopment, huge amount of tasks that we have to do. So both of these are realities, that your aggregate capabilities grow. Therefore, what you can do with those capabilities, as I said, you can run a space program, Singapore can't. You do a whole range of AI software, which Singapore does not do. So size gives you certain advantages. But the reality of internal underdevelopment is true. I mean, we didn't forget it, we didn't deny it. We said that's a part of the problem.
Yeah.
The question is, does your aggregate capability give you opportunities in a way that you can lift up all the boats in the country?
Yeah.
That is our challenge, not is a one or the other reality. The twin realities, both of which is how we use them to a maximum advantage.
Absolutely, and the social and environmental aspects have also to be role modeled in our development. I will give a chance to a young lady here. Yes.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. My question is that although it's not officially declared, but it has been estimated that India is now the most populous country in the world. So what is your take on that? Do you think it's an advantageous situation, or does it have some disadvantages as well?
You want to answer, any one of you? I'll add.
Yes, we don't have the 2021 census yet, so all population figures are based on projections. Yes, India is the most populous country in the world now. Population means that you have productive assets. Provided those productive assets are being deployed efficiently to add to national income, which means you need education, you need health, and you need a whole set of other things that are required for empowerment. However, I would also like to flag the fact that India's rate of population growth is now slowing down. The annual rate of population growth is 0.8%. So the young India is not going to remain young India for eternity. Beyond 2035, India will age. And India, like China, will be a country which will, so to speak, age before it is developed. So there will be enormous issues. So far as our population figures are concerned, we will probably be at about 1.6 billion in 2047, but taper off a few years after that.
May I add to that your question is really about the demographic dividend that we can get. Yes, we can get, I think it's been estimated something like 30%, precisely because not only do we have a large population, but 60% are young in that. We have the largest youth cohort in the world. So that's the power, the youth power, and I would say woman power, that can really be an asset, provided they are empowered themselves, skilled, education, health, all of those. So there is this very big potential that we have, which other countries don't, and which can power our greatness, I feel. But Raja, you want to add to that, or I want to?
No, go ahead. Good.
Sir, you in front. Yes, Mr. Moth.
Well, I wanted to ask you a simple question about water. That every year we hear these stories of water scarcity across India, and everywhere we hear the story of floods across UP, Bihar, and all the northeastern state. Where have we reached on getting potable water all across the country, and on harnessing the waters of hope, which Varghese wrote about 30, 40 years ago?
It requires, actually, a satisfactory answer requires a session in itself.
Yeah.
So far as getting every household water from the tap at the retail level is concerned, we should be pretty close to getting that by 2024. But water raises several other issues. This is just retail level. We need to talk about quality of water. We need to talk about management of water. We need to manage water from the surplus areas to the deficit areas. So a whole range of issues, and I would say it's still work in progress. It cannot be solved overnight, but in passing, I will mention two other things. One is, if you need the right allocation decisions, you must price resources, particularly scarce resources, right.
Yeah.
The second one is a decentralization of property rights, including that on water. But as I said, an unsatisfactory answer, because this is like 9 p.m. TV, give 30 seconds. This is the best I can do.
Thank you, and with that, I'm afraid that we are running out of time, but I want to make just one concluding point and something for all of you to think about, because Rahul Sagar, in an article here, talks about the ideas, not only the idea of India, but also the ideas that India represents will also take India to greatness, but also be an asset to the world. And he talks about this civilizational catharsis that we need to have from prioritizing, you know, this concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that it's one world, one family, but prioritizing Rashtra Dharma. Have that, as you said, Raja, to have the will to power. India must cultivate civilizationally, transform itself to have a will to power, and then it will get there. So with that thought, I hope this book and this discussion we have had on the book has whetted your appetite. And as Rahul Sagar says, that you have to not only be, hungry, but you must not only have the appetite for power, but hungry enough to grasp it. So with that thought, thank you all very much.
We would like to thank C. Raja Mohan, Bibek Debroy, and Lakshmi Puri for that fascinating and thought-provoking conversation. As always, do please help us keep the festival venues clean and dispose of your waste and waste bins in all the bins, placed across Amir or the hotel as well. We'll shortly be having the Bank of Baroda award ceremony, so please do stay for that. And then that session is followed by a session with Mr. Javed Akhtar. Thank you.